Ménglóng, the Misty Poets, Poetry in the Context of China's Authoritarian Cultural Revolution, imposed by Chairman Mao Zedong in the People's Republic of China. A presentation by Alys Caviness-Gober, Second Vice President, Poetry Society of Indiana. Poetry Society of Indiana, also known as PSI, hosts First Tuesdays membership meetings, and this presentation was originally given for the July 2022 members-only meeting. The members received a presentation packet that has the text of the longer poems and a lot of the historical background in it. So for those of you who are watching on YouTube, I apologize that you do not have access to that, but it was for our Poetry Society of Indiana members only. However, you can look up the Misty Poets and some of their life information and some of the historical background in which they conceived and wrote their poetry. Let's get started with the presentation. And first up, I want to introduce you to this wonderful poem. It's a long 6-part poem titled Forever Parted Graveyard, and it's by Misty poet Gu Chang. Gu Chang lived from September 24th, 1956 to October 8th, 1993, and this image is the plaque in the famous Library Walk in Manhattan in New York. And the excerpt itself, again, is from the longer 6-part poem. I'm going to just read this excerpt to you in case the visual isn't that great online. Now on my heart's page there is no grid to guide my hand, no character to trace, only the moisture, the ink blue dew that has dripped from the leaves. To spread it, I can't use a pen, I can't use a writing brush. Can only use my life's gentlest breath to make a single line of marks worth puzzling over. Oh, I just really love that so much. I also need to apologize before we move any further for 2 other things. I don't speak Chinese. I don't understand the language. I'm illiterate in Chinese, so I apologize if I mispronounce anyone's names and or words in this presentation. Also, it's July in Indiana, and I have chronic sinusitis and seasonal allergies, so I apologize if I have the sniffles or need to clear my throat throughout the presentation. There you go. Okay, so the Ménglóng, the Misty Poets. These were poets, a group of 20th century Chinese poets who wrote in reaction against the restrictions on art during the Cultural Revolution of 1966 to 1976. And I want to give a little bit of historical background about that time period. First, we have to go back even further. On the 1st of October in 1949, Mao Zedong declared the creation of the People's Republic of China. Mao was the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, and the stated goal of the PRC was to preserve Chinese communism by purging remnants of capitalism and traditional elements of Chinese society in a series of campaigns and 5-year plans. The second 5-year plan, an economic and social plan executed from 1958 to 1962, was known as the Great Leap Forward and caused an estimated 45 million deaths. It was during that time period, in that second 5-year plan, that many of the Misty Poets were either born or were children alive during that time, and so they were witness to everything that was going on in that time period. In 1966, Mao and his allies launched the Cultural Revolution. It continued until Mao's death a decade later. The Cultural Revolution, motivated by power struggles within the party and a fear of the Soviet Union, led to a major upheaval in Chinese society. Now, this is the context in which the Misty Poets wrote their poetry. During the Cultural Revolution, Mao Zedong decreed certain cultural requirements for all literature and art in China. According to these ideas, writers and artists were to form a cultural army to educate the masses and provide them with revolutionary values. All art would be political. There would be no art for art's sake. According to the requirements, poetry was to be compliant and realistic, as the following two examples show. Both of these are taken as excerpts, if you will. The first is by Wu Shute from We Shall Always Follow the Party, and the second is from Guo Moro from In Praise of New China. And again, I'm going to just read these to you in case the visuals aren't so great. The moon follows the earth follows the sun. Oil follows our steps, and we shall always follow the Communist Party. The second one. The people arc, industrious and courageous, enforce national defense, revolutionize traditions. Strong is the leadership of our communist government, herald of the proletariat. Industrialization, rainbow-like atmosphere. Tillers own their lands. Earth belongs to all. May our glorious fatherland steadily advance to utopia. I don't think I really need to beat those two excerpts to death. It's pretty clear they are following the requirements of the Cultural Revolution in terms of the goal of poetry, and the only published poetry officially was poetry like this. The effect of the Cultural Revolution on Chinese culture, therefore, and the lives of everyday Chinese people was actually quite horrific. In the late 1960s and early 70s, excuse me, this was a civil war-like state, if you will, and many Chinese youths were sent to the country under a program whose slogan was up to the mountains and down to the countryside. I can't pronounce the one word, Chinese word that encompassed that slogan, but this was a movement, if you will. The up to the mountains and down to the countryside movement was a policy instituted in the People's Republic of China by Chairman Mao. Mao believed pro-bourgeoisie thinking was still too prevalent, and remember, he had formed the People's Republic of China in 1949, and it's now the late 60s, early 70s, and he just wanted things to move on faster, I guess, and so he declared certain privileged urban youth and sometimes entire families would be sent to mountainous areas or farming villages to learn, quote, learn from the workers and farmers. Now, the movement consisted of a policy that included that the oldest child in a family had to go, was forced to go, was removed from the family and sent to, a mountainous area or a farming village to learn from the workers and farmers. Now, younger siblings could volunteer to go in the eldest child's place, and you can probably not stretch your imagination too far to read between the lines of, quote, volunteer, end quote, and realize that some families sacrificed a younger sibling and sent that younger sibling as a, quote, volunteer in order to keep the eldest child at home. In total, approximately 17 million youth were sent to rural or mountainous areas as a result of the up to the mountains and down to the countryside movement. During this time period and within this movement, future Misty poet Gu Cheng's family was sent to rural Shandong to breed pigs. He was 12 years old. The deportees and many other Chinese felt disillusioned after the Cultural Revolution, which ended again in 1976, and it was described across the country as, quote, 10 lost years, end quote. Although publishing literature and art that didn't conform with the Cultural Revolution's rules was banned during the Cultural Revolution, extensive underground poetry circulated, which was written under extreme conditions. For example, Gu Cheng started writing poetry in a pigsty, and Bai Dao, another Misty poet, wrote his first plays in the evenings after work. That brings us to Ménglóng Shiren, the Misty Poets. The Misty Poets are named the Misty Poets because their work was officially denounced as Ménglóng Shi, obscure, misty, or hazy poetry. However, Misty poet Gu Cheng said, The defining characteristic of this new type of poetry is its realism. It begins with objective realism, but veers towards a subjective realism. It moves from a passive reaction toward active creation. That's so important to think about that. Passive reaction toward active creation. So the Misty Poet's work wasn't published officially by any, publications in the People's Republic of China. However, it was published in an unofficial magazine titled Jintian. I may not be pronouncing that correctly. Translates as Today. The first issue was published in 1978, over a decade into the Cultural Revolution. It was founded by Bai Dao and Mang Qi, both Misty poets, and it was published, like I said, until it was banned in 1980. I want to just say real quickly, this isn't in the slide, but I want to say it real quickly, that 5 important Misty poets, Bai Dao, Gu Chang, Shu Ting, He Dong, and Yang Lian, were exiled from China after the Tiananmen Square protests of 1989. That's 9 years after their publication was banned in China. But Jintian was resurrected in Sweden in 1990 as a forum for expatriate Chinese writers. Anyway, back to this first issue. Excuse me. This first 1978 issue of Jintian. It contained the seminal poem The Answer, which was written by Bai Dao. The poem is regarded as a paradigm for the obscure nature of Misty poetry. Now, in the packet for PSI members, excuse me, the text of the poem is included. However, it's a little bit too long to put on a slide or on a visual in this presentation for viewers to read comfortably. So I'm just going to read it for you, and then we'll talk about it just a little bit. Let me pause for a sip of water. Sorry, I lied. It was coffee. Okay. The Answer. Debasement is the password of the base, nobility the epitaph of the noble. See how the gilded sky is covered with the drifting, twisted shadows of the dead. The Ice Age is over now. Why is there ice everywhere? The Cape of Good Hope has been discovered. Why do 1,000 sails contest the Dead Sea? I came into this world, bringing only paper, rope, a shadow, to proclaim before the judgment the voice that has been judged. Let me tell you, world, I do not believe. If 1,000 challengers lie beneath your feet, count me as number 1,001. I don't believe the sky is blue. I don't believe in thunder's echoes. I don't believe that dreams are false. I don't believe that death has no revenge. If the sea is destined to breach the dikes, let all the brackish water pour into my heart. If the land is destined to rise, let humanity choose a peak for existence again. A new conjunction and glimmering stars adorn the unobstructed sky now. They are the pictographs from 5,000 years. They are the watchful eyes of future generations. I just love that. That's so incredible, isn't it? I encourage you to look it up if you're listening on YouTube. Look up the poem in its entirety. But my focus point for this poem is that phrase, I do not believe. And that's the way you see it on the screen is the way it appears in English language translations. And I can't pronounce the Chinese phrase for that line, but I think it's very important for us to understand that the one line, I do not believe, became a buzzword, if you will, a cultural buzzword or buzz phrase, maybe I should say, at the time. Because with that one line, Bai Dao eloquently and forcefully ridiculed the post-totalitarian system and expressed refusal to believe in the faux reality crafted by the Communist Party. It's just one line, okay, can make a difference. So keep that in mind as you're thinking about the context that the Misty Poets were writing in. Now, the last Misty Poets poem I want to share with you takes us back to Gu Chang. It's his 2-line poem titled A Generation. It is perhaps Gu Cheng's most famous contribution to contemporary Chinese literature, and it's considered an accurate representation of the Chinese Cultural Revolution's younger generation's feelings as they sought knowledge and a future. And I think for our younger poets living today, I think this will really resonate with them. So here is A Generation. The darkest night gave me dark-colored eyes, yet with them I'm seeking light. I think that's just so poignant, don't you? It just really kind of gives me a chill when I think about it. So I actually put this presentation together several months ago. Again, it's now July 2022, and things have changed since in America since I put this presentation together originally. In the last month or so, we've had some things going on, like the January 6th committee hearings, some Supreme Court decisions, more mass shootings, just different things that have caused some turmoil and dismay for American culture and democracy. And so, my presentation might sound very political, and I am not trying to avoid that. For PSI members, you have heard me present on protest poetry in the past. I firmly believe that if you are a creative person, part of that means speaking to what's going on in your lifetime, culturally, politically, whatever. And so protest poetry and things like the Misty poets' poetry speaks to me. And so I can't, ignore the fact that this is a fairly political presentation. I want to leave you with something that's actually not a poem. I go back to April 2022 when comedian Jon Stewart accepted the Mark Twain Prize for American Humor. There were parts of his acceptance speech that really echoes the historical context behind the poetry of the Misty Poets, and also speaks to the challenges that Americans are facing today, and not just Americans, but people all over the world who are under the threat of authoritarianism. And I want to share with you, I put together a quote which is, different lines from his speech. You can watch the entire acceptance speech on YouTube, but this is what I wanted to share with you today. It's not the woke police that are going to be an existential threat to comedy. It's not the Fresh Prince, it's the Crown Prince. It's not the fragility of audiences, it's the fragility of leaders. Comedy doesn't change the world, but it's a bellwether. When a society is under threat, comedians are the ones who get sent away first. It's just a reminder to people that democracy is under threat. Authoritarians are the threat to comedy, to music, to thought, to poetry, to progress, to all those things. It ain't the pronoun police, it's the secret police. It always has been, and it always will be. And this man's decapitated visage is a reminder to all of us that what we have is fragile and precious, and the way to guard against it isn't to change how audiences think, it's to change how leaders lead. So kudos to comedian Jon Stewart for hitting the nail on the head. Go back to what the Gu Cheng quote from the beginning of this presentation, when he said that the poetry moves from passive reaction to active creation. That's what Jon Stewart is saying. Poetry doesn't change the world, but it's a bellwether. It's a clarion call, right? And that's what protest poetry has always done. And the Misty Poets' poetry is protest poetry, by another name. So, we're all poets here in Poetry Society of Indiana, and I just want to encourage everybody, let's all write some Ménglóng, some Misty poetry, shall we? Let's speak out. Let's try to change how leaders lead. And I think I should end with that and just encourage everybody to look up the Misty poets, examine all of this further, and start writing. Thank you for your time.